Hello students, welcome back to this course, and so far we have looked into various aspects of visuality. We have talked about visuality from starting from communicational aspects, then we looked at what are the characteristics in a composition, and then we looked at how visual perception affects and is dependent on certain phenomena which is very prevalent in visual practice. And in doing all of that, you have encountered one word very often, which is the cultural aspect. We have always talked about communication being part of a particular culture or a community or a society. So you have heard of these terms. So today I thought of dedicating this particular lecture to talk something about culture. What a culture is, how when we talk about visual culture, how is it rooted to culture, and as a part of this course, as we understand that our meanings and our semiotic understanding depends largely on culture, we need to look at certain attributes of culture and then knit it back to whatever we are doing. So we will see something very profound today. We will deep dive into something which is very relevant and crucial when it comes to visual semiotics or visual communication both, or visual design for that matter, and have an understanding of that. So today we will cover three things. One is visual culture, then we will talk about visual persuasion. We talked about persuasion a little bit when we were talking about the professional areas of visual communication, and then we will talk about visual literacy. So these three things go hand in hand, and they are the driving force for any visual communication that is happening. So we need to understand that in a little detail today. So if we look at the definition of culture as such, so this is the complex whole. This is by Tyler in way back in 1974. So this is a complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of the society. So we will come to the later definition, which is a much more modern definition a little later. But if we look at the older definition, the classical definition, so it says, it pinpoints that in a human society, we are social creatures, we are devices of a society, we frame society and we are part of the society. So while we are living in a society, while we are forming a society, as a part of the habit, as a part of various capabilities, where various functioning of the society as individuals and as a group, what we are evolving certain shared knowledge, we are evolving certain art, we are evolving certain beliefs, we are evolving certain morals, laws, customs, rituals, all these things together. So these are various devices of a culture which emerges owing to people coming together. So when there is a group of people coming together, they have to rely on certain common practices, certain common beliefs, certain common thoughts, and that is what shapes up a culture. So as you can understand, culture has its root in human society, in human living, and more than that, in human capabilities, activities and habits. So it is dependent on something very inherent in human attributes, and that forms the culture. So that is a little bit of classical standpoint of defining culture. But if we look at a newer version, very recent definition of culture by James, if we look at that, what does it say? Social domain that emphasizes the practices, discourses and material expression which over time express the continuities and discontinuities of social meaning of a life held in common. So very interesting definition, which talks about two things, which talks about an expressionism, okay, which talks about some kind of expressionism which builds up in a society. So, there are different kinds of expressionism which builds up in a society, be it art and be it art, literature. So, there are different forms of expressions. It could be the practices, it could be rituals, it could be festivities, many other things. So, a culture is defined as a whole of all these expressions that we have as a social being, as a social practice what we are doing, and it is over time express. So, this is over time express the continuities and discontinuities of social meaning of life held in common. So, that in nutshell means that there are certain practices which continues and there are certain discontinuities which happen in a course of time, but what is that meaning that is there with us even if the culture changes and evolves, but it has certain deep lasting meaning and impression with us as a culture, and that keeps on staying with us. So, in these two definitions we see that they are hinting towards the same thing. They are ultimately leading to a human social practice and that expressionism of human social practice, which over time either continues or discontinues, but it has some impact on us. So, this is in nutshell what culture is, and we are all part of certain culture. Certain cultures are flat global, certain cultures are very localized, certain cultures are evolving, certain cultures are static. Whatever it is, we are part and parcel of this. Now, coming to what visual culture predominantly is. So, one is a culture, as we see, it is a huge domain. You know, there are different aspects of culture owing to human society, but if we narrow down now to visual culture, what visual culture predominantly means, we will look at the definition, and also we will look at another aspect of culture, which is where we are going back to the semiotic model, and you have the interpretant, you have the object, and you have the signifier. And as you see, we have talked about the understanding and the knowledge, the knowledge and belief. So, the traditional one was rooted more with the knowledge of the interpretant and the object, and if we see the next one, the later one is emphasizing on the expressionism. So, the signifier, and then there is an expressionism with the interpretant. So, the classical definition was relying more on the knowledge base and the outward products of this knowledge base, which are the common practices, common beliefs, law, art, everything, but this is based on the interpretant's knowledge about an object, and then you are looking at it collectively. So, that was the classical form of looking at it, but when we are looking at a more modernist approach to culture, we see that there are the signs and there is an expressionism, and this expressionism is rooted with the interpretant, and hence there is a continuity and a discontinuity amongst that over course of time. So, this expressionism changes, but however, all of that is a product of a society. Okay. So, now we look onto visual culture, and in visual culture we will see three distinct boundaries when it comes to definition. So, visual culture is a condition in which human experience is profoundly affected by images, new technologies of looking, and various practices of seeing, showing, and picturing. So, what does this mean is, the first definition, if we look at the first perspective we are looking at visual culture, is that it is profoundly dependent on images, that is one, and it is also dependent on the practices related to images. So, the practices of what is being shown to you, how you are seeing certain things. We have talked about this in the past also, but now we are adding an cultural attribute. This is a collective attribute as part of the society. How are you seeing a thing? How are you approaching a thing? Not only that, what are the practices of showing and picturing things to you. So, that is something which governs your visual culture to a great extent, and that is the first domain where we hit on to the way we are seeing things and the way we are shown things. So, that both of them together is forming a connection with the images that we see, and that forms the first definition. So, it is the human experience which is affected by images and new technologies of looking, various practices of seeing and all that. So, now if we come to the attribute, what is the major thing which is coming out of that is experience. So, from the first definition, if we bring out the gist of it, is the experiential aspect that revolves around in our culture. So, if now I say what is the predominant visual culture that you live in, what is the predominant visual culture that is around you, you look for your different experiences with images. Okay, so, you try to collate these experiences into together. Is this experience, what are the things that you see, what are the things that is being shown to you, and what are the experiences that you are having with these images over course of time will govern your visual culture, will govern or will give a hint to what kind of visual culture that you live in. Okay, so, that is the first starting point of visual culture. Now, if we go to the second aspect of visual culture, so visual culture is a critical field of study. So, it is a critical field of study that examines and interprets differing primary visual manifestations and experiences in the culture. So, experience part we have already covered, but here we will see that it is a field of study which examines and interprets differing primary visual manifestation. So, here we are talking about a field of study. So, visual culture is definitely a field of study. Many look at it from the experiential aspect. Here we are looking at it as a field of study, like design. It is a field of study, it is a process, it is a product. So, we look at it from different aspects, but what is important here is what is this field of study doing? The field of study is trying to examine and interpret differing primary visual manifestation. So, you are trying to analyze, you are trying to interpret the visual manifestation. So, whatever imagery that you have is a visual manifestation, and here the stress is given more on the visual manifestation rather than what you are experiencing, not that visual manifestation, and then there is an interpretation aspect which comes along with it. So, the second attribute, if you see, is talking about the manifestation. So, if we look at the first one, the first definition was talking about experiences, and the second definition is talking about manifestations. So, experiences revolve around your personal encounter with images, and manifestation is the personal examination and interpretation. So, whenever it comes to a manifestation of a particular image, you are bringing in your own analytical function to analyze that manifestation. Whatever is presented to you, immediately your brain is acting on some kind of analytical features on that manifestation and is trying to interpret that. So, that is another aspect of visual culture. So, if I ask you what kind of visual culture that is predominant with you, you will look at various manifestations, and then you will look at what kind of analytical approach you are taking to analyze that. So, for that we have talked about the metaphors, connotations, denotations. So, all these things will come into picture, but what is predominantly happening, and that is what defines your visual culture. Now, come to the third aspect, sorry, the numbering was wrong there, it would be first, second and third one. So, visual culture is an inclusive set of images, objects and apparatuses, projects, products and things of visual culture. So, this talks more of visual culture as a product. So, we looked at three aspects. The first aspect was experience, the second aspect was manifestation, and the third aspect is the product. The products arising out of a visual culture, which are inclusive set of images. So, now if you look at a closer look at the visual culture, you will see all these products which are essentially images in our case, they are connected with each other and they are forming as if bits and pieces of a puzzle inside a culture, inside a visual culture. So, that what will frame your visual culture, your predominant visual culture that you settle in. So, these are three essential ways of defining visual culture or analyzing visual culture. One is the experiences that you are having with images, one is the manifestations which these images have, and third is what are the products that we are encountering as a part of this world of images, and that defines your visual culture. Okay. So, let us move on to the next step where we are looking at visual culture. So, as a part of seeing and being seen. So, if you see the first, second and third definition deal in large part with the processes of seeing and being seen while constructing individual and collective identity through everyday life. So, what that does mean? Whatever experiences that you have, whatever manifestations that you encounter, whatever products that you deal with, they are all a part of seeing and how are you being seen. So, this is a very, very crucial way where the cultural studies people or culture studies expert define visual culture as is one is the seeing, you are seeing something, right, that ends there. Another thing about visual culture, that is how the society is driven and the visual culture is formed, is the way I want things to be seen. It's the way I want myself to be seen by others will define what will happen as a next step in visual culture, isn't it? So, one is what you are seeing. You are seeing certain kind of trends around you, you are seeing certain kind of colors, certain kind of fashion, certain kind of movies, certain kind of imagery around you. That is one part. Seeing won't affect culture as much as now you want being seen. So, how do you want to be seen as a part of that culture? So, if you are adopting that fashion, if you are adopting that color, if you are adopting mechanisms which has been shown imagery, simile, metaphors in your lives, in your way of representation also, then it is part of a cohesive visual culture. And why are you doing all this? Because by all this you are trying to create an individual or collective identity. So, basically what you are trying to do over here is by this seeing and by this being seen, the desire of being seen in a particular fashion, what you are trying to achieve? You are trying to achieve an identity, either individually or collectively. You are part of a collection of people anyway, and hence you are trying to adopt to certain kind of identity, or you are individualistic and adopting to certain kind of identity. Mind it, this identity creation is thoroughly based on what you are seeing and what you want yourself to be seen as. Very, very important aspect in a visual culture study. So, the identity is much dependent on how we see ourselves. So one part is like how are we looking at ourselves, that's what is creating our identity, right, and how we imagine others to see us. So this is something which we need to understand, which we already talked about. So one part is how we see ourselves, and the other part is how we are imagining others are seeing us, and hence you start shaping up everything around you. You should start shaping up yourself, and you start shaping up everything around you. You start shaping up everything that you create, and this is all part of an imagery, and that's what affects visual culture in large. So graphically I have tried to depict this. Say this is an individual, and this is how we see ourselves. So A dash represents something which is a representation, and this is how we see ourselves in context to our society. So we will come to that. The way you are seeing yourself is also dependent on what you have seen in the past or what you are being shown. So this particular A to A dash relationship is based on your interaction with the society. Not only that, now the visual culture, the identity is also dependent on B. So this is where you are now also dependent on how B is looking at you, or how A is imagining B is looking at it, and B also has an exposure to A dash. So you think that A is having a reflection of A dash, this is how he or she sees himself or herself, and you are imagining that B is also looking at A in a way B looks at A dashed. So there is a connection with an hypothetical objectivity which is A dashed, and that is nothing but something which is created by a designer. So that is depicted by D. So this particular A dashed is a product with which you relate to, is a product with which you are relating your identity to, because that is something you want yourself to be seen, and that is what you want others to see you as. Very, very profound concept, and that is what is designed by a third externality who is a designer, who observes the society, and this all is part of a culture. You are not doing something alien, you are looking at a culture, understanding the needs and demands of this particular individual, you understand the needs and demands of this particular individual, and hence you are designing a communication channel which fits with it. So this is exactly what is happening in a culture, and more precisely what is happening in a visual culture, and which is related to the whole concept of creating identity and the whole concept of how you are seeing and how you are being seen, and that is shaping up. So this is happening at each level, and each one is following something or the other, and collectively as a culture, collectively as a society, we are setting up some thresholds, we are setting up A dashed for our culture, and that is exactly what visual culture does. Very, very crucial aspect which as designers, as communicators, as a layman we should understand, because there one plays a very, very important role where you can change the whole way of creating identity, the whole way how the visual culture is working. So now let's move forward, where we are looking at image as a product. Okay, so what are the attributes? Image is definitely related to an identity. We are living in a world of image, and then identity is related to consumerism. So with an image, what happens? We are creating some kind of identity. Whenever I say, we talked about this example of Hollywood. Okay, when we talk about Hollywood, an image comes into your mind, and this image creates an identity. Are you part of it? You are not part of it. Are you aspiring? You are not aspiring, something like that. Now as a next level, this image is part of a consumerist nature of an individual. Is this selling? Am I consuming this image? So we are part of this whole image consumption attribute in our society. We are consuming images more than anything else in past few decades, where the proliferation of internet and communication media has vastly percolated in our lives. So, we are consuming images all the time. We are consuming it from a point of view of relating with that identity. We have talked about that, what are the avenues for an informational purpose, for a persuasive purpose, for educational purpose, for administrative purpose. We are flooded with these images and we are consuming that. So, there is this identity related, how we are looking, people are seeing at us and we want to be seen, is related to consumerism, and consumerism leads to image as a commodity. Okay. So, we are going step by step, and then this sense of commodity, sense of commoditization brings competition, and competition brings comparison on reliability and utility. So, these are step by step attribute we see as soon as an image becomes a product. So, it holds such a strong notion with it. It holds a notion of identity. Identity has a notion of consumerism attached with it, because we are talking about how we are seeing and how we want to be seen. So, hence we require some kind of attributional relationship in terms of commoditization, commercialization, and commercialization definitely brings with it sense of competition, and competition of course brings a sense of how do you compare, how do you compare two things. It is based on the utility and it is based on reliability. So, now let us a closer look at how the reliability and utility works in our case. So, if you look at reliability, what does it ask for? It asks whether the source can be trusted or authentic. That is the question that we ask when it comes to reliability. And then utility asks whether the source is useful and what value it has got. So, whenever we are encountering with an image, in our subconscious mind we are judging that image by these two attributes, owing to image being a commodity. Isn't it so? Whenever you are looking at an image, first thing that comes to your mind is the authenticity. You ask for what is the reliability aspect of this image. Am I at all going to spend time on it? Am I at all going to consume that image and go for a deeper attribute? That is what is happening all the time, even before you start making some decision. You have a reliability check on it, and the next thing that happens or parallelly happens is you are having a utility check on that image, that you look at what is the value that it holds to me as a part of the entire culture. We have talked about the culture now as a part of the entire scenario. Does it hold anything to me? And based on that you take the next decision. So, reliability can be brought into utility. Reliability of source is important in making a judgment on its usefulness. So, if a source is reliable, if you are finding something reliable, you may find it useful. So, you may go to the next step and it is affecting that. But however, utility is not dependent on reliability as such. Utility is free function, it works on its own and it is not a part of reliability. However, over course of time, reliability starts affecting your utilitarian aspect to a great extent. Now, let us look at the other aspect. So, there is any source will contain some kind of bias. Okay, that is very much understandable. No source is completely reliable or unreliable, as you can understand. A source may not be reliable, but it could be useful. So, many a times a source is not reliable, but it could be useful in various fashion, and a source could be very useful in manifesting the values and attitudes of a time. So, these are certain attributes that we understand, which is arising of this usefulness and reliability aspect of it. There are bias, and we are part of this bias, either positive or negative bias. So, that is happening all the time in a culture, and as a designer you have to analyze this bias that we have with culture. No source is completely reliable or unreliable. So, every source has to be judged, it has to be analyzed and prudently consumed by the user. If we look at other attributes, is that a source is not reliable but could be useful, and more importantly it manifests some amount of value and attitudes of time. So, that leads to some connection with your culture. So, now let us move on to the next step, where we are talking about visual persuasion as such. So, visual persuasion is nothing but a science based visually oriented method to influence the decision making of people, government and business. So, what is important over here is a science based visually oriented method that influence decision making. So, we have talked about persuasion when we were talking about advertising and one course of. So, here we are trying to channelize the behavior, channelize the attitude of people and affect the decision making of people to some extent. So, this is what we are trying to do by visual persuasion. So, if we look at the sketch wise analysis, so what a persuasion does is you are trying to affect the decision making. So, at the end of the day you are trying to affect the decision making. The examples of such are the social media, news and media, litigation graphics and all these kind of things, where you see that the jury will understand and retain information 650% faster when a visual presentation is used. So, you can understand how your decision making could be made more robust, efficient, fast when you are using a visual representation, and that is what is happening at a social level, at a business level, at an administrative level today. We are relying heavily on images. So, I will give you one example where you can see that for a persuasive mode. So, this is the picture of Washington and you can see White House over here. So, this is the situation now, but with the change of real estate development and all is forcing there is a lot of demand, and there if you see that if the building height, permissible building height is increased, which is the demand of the society, now you are having a perspective of the White House with this. So, you can understand how it has changed. So, the visual persuasion is affecting, it is thrusting that whether you want that, you don't want that. It is affecting your decision making at a sublime level. You can reach to a decision very quickly that I have White House which has a particular importance coming to politically, philosophically, architecturally, and then there is a demand for growing the city, there is a demand for housing needs, and you need to grow vertically up, which is very logical. But then what is the decision juncture that you take, and what helped us over here is a persuasive image that has helped us over here. So, let us take a look at what is happening when we are talking about visual persuasion. So, this is a graph where you are indicating understanding level on this x axis and the context on the y axis. So, it percolates from here. So, there is a starting point where you have data, you have little understanding of that and you have a little context towards it, and there is a producer of data. So, that is being churned and you are creating some kind of information. So, here the understanding is more clear and you are contextualizing that data. So, we are moving up the ladder and someone is producing that. But now comes the consumption of this information, and that is going at the consumer end, where you have certain kind of knowledge with this information that is being thrust by the producer, and you are starting to consume that, you are starting to experience that. And here the contextualization is more, the understanding is more, and then you go to the highest level of wisdom where you retain the highest contextualization and you retain the highest understanding of this, and all of that is taking shape in a socio-cultural domain. Now, if we look at the next graphic, which is, I would suggest a graphic description. If you do not want to look at this graphic, do not, but what is saying, not everyone who gets hit by a drunk driver dies. So, this is showing something even worse. So, this was a lady who was being hit by a drunk driver. This is a promotion by the development of transportation. Don't drink and drive, that is the visual that they are creating, but look at how the data being transferred into information. So, someone is creating information, but that is being consumed by a consumer, and hence you are making some knowledge, and then it is going to an upper level of wisdom. So, this is sometimes we move forward in that ladder, we are taking help of persuasive imagery. Visual persuasion is a very strong persuasion, as you have seen in this image, it has such a strong impact utilizing all of these steps. Okay. So, that pretty much covers our visual perception, but there are certain critical aspects towards visual perception. So, there is a drastic image manipulation which happens, which has an intentionality, and this, as you can understand, that this visual manipulation could be led to a wrong intention, could be led to a right intention. So, there is an intentionality aspect to it, and there is a lack of truthfulness hence. So, we have to be very, very cautious about this aspect. There are ethical challenges that we have got. Then another aspect of visual persuasion coming to from a critical point of view is idealization. There is a sense of idealization, and that brings with it a self comparison and change of expectation. So, when you are idealizing something, we have talked about realism and idealism. So, many a times we see that persuasive images thrust onto idealism, okay, and then comes a self comparison. Many of the advertisements talking about a beauty product or something shows an idealized form, and based on that the viewers start doing a self comparison. There is a sense of self comparison, there is the expectations change, and for what, which is very, very different from reality, which is not correct thing to do. So, what you are trying to do over here, you are trying to bring a standardization which is not there in human society. You are trying to create desirable circumstances which fit for only few, which is not for mass, and you use tools which make things appear which are actually not. So, it is a pseudo demand, it is a pseudo expectation that you are creating by this idealization, by your thrusting, you are pushing people towards something which is not correct, which is not relevant, which does not happen in reality. So, that is another aspect which we need to critically look at. Then there is a chance of stereotyping. Many a times you will see advertisements or this visual imagery stereotype things, because there is a metaphoric connotation. There is a gender wise stereotyping, there is a caste wise stereotyping, there is community wise stereotyping. So, you will see many of the times the minorities are not shown in a reliable, respectable position in a imagery. Why is that? Because you have stereotyped certain things, you are taking, and that stereotype continues. So, you are taking, so there is a chance of stereotyping when it comes to visual persuasion, and many a times we see the last but not the least is dependence on sexual proliferation, sexual appeal as one of a strong feature of visual perception. So, these are some of the critical aspects we need to keep in mind when we are looking at visual perception as such. And why this understanding is important is because now we are moving to the next step of visual literacy. So, you understand all of this persuasion, all of this culture based on, if you have a visual literacy, like you have academic literacy, there is a thing which is visual literacy, and visual literacy banks on three particular things. One is the visual thinking. If you see, this is based on Trumbo's concept, a holistic construct of visual literacy is dependent on visual thinking, where you are incorporating images in your conscious and preconscious thought process. There is a visual learning which is associated with it, and there is a visual communication which is associated with it. So, visual learning has two processes: the process of gaining awareness of meaning of visuals, and the process and person uses to interpret meaning from visuals. And then you have visual communication, where the use of images for expressing ideas and convey meanings to others. So, these three aspects are very, very important. If you see, what is visual literacy talking about? Is talking about visual thinking in first place, where you are taking help of images as a thought process. So, you are taking help of images as a part of your thought process. So, this is governed by when you are practicing using image as part of your thought process. So, this comes as a part of visual literacy. The first part, you are thinking based on images. Okay. So, when we say A for apple, our visual literacy starts from there. So, when you say A for apple, so that means you are connecting an alphabet a word, a concept with something which is visual. So, the starting point of visual thinking starts for all of us with this notion of thinking or subconsciously thinking in terms of visual literacy. Then we have something which is related to visual learning, the next step. So, this is step 1, this is step 2, which is related to visual learning, and visual learning has two processes. One is the awareness about this image. So, whatever we are encountering, you are aware what that image holds, what meaning that image holds. So, you are aware of that meaning. So, that is how you learn, you start learning about that image more, you get aware, you start more about understanding the meaning of it. And the second part of visual learning is you are trying to interpret that. You are trying to interpret, you are trying to learn something from those visuals. So, one part is just an awareness about that image, and the second part is the interpretation of the meaning of that image. So, these two form the visual learning, and the third part is visual communication, where you are actually utilizing image to express. So, apart from visual thinking, where you have started your thought process relating images, the second part is you have built up your awareness about images, you have built up your awareness about interpreting images, and only then you will be able to communicate now with images. So, you have an idea and you want to communicate to someone, and you will use some kind of image for communicating that. So, this is what is the entire domain of visual literacy, and that is what leads us to the whole concept of understanding visual literacy. And if we see why visual literacy is important, because this acts, this gives us a sense of awareness, this gives us a self defense and some kind of protection and balance. Why do we need that? Because we live in a world of visual persuasion, and you see there are critical aspects of visual persuasion. So, this gives us the strong armature, this gives us the fight back to balance the things. One is a persuasive thing which is forcing you, but if you are there with visual literacy, you will be able to counteract, you will be able to take an unbiased decision which is true to the context. So, that brings us to the end of understanding visual culture. In very brief I have discussed, but visual culture, visual persuasion and the visual literacy. In our next concluding classes, we will look at some of the aspects of how image and text come together and build a context, and some of the applications and implications of visual semiotics in visual communication. Thank you very much.